The keycard printer jammed again at exactly 2:47 a.m. That was the third time that winter, always the same hour, always that same clicking grind, like it didn't want to spit the card out. Len was downstairs, checking the boiler. I was alone at the front desk. Snow tapped gently against the lobby windows in that soft, constant way that made it easy to forget how cold it really was outside. Then I heard the lobby door open. No footsteps, no voice, just the soft chime, and then silence. When I looked up, Shade Man was already standing at the counter, coat soaked, hood up, not moving. Let me know where you're listening from tonight and if you've ever stayed somewhere that just didn't feel quite right. And if these stories help keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. My name's Dana Ellis. I was 37 when this happened. I worked the overnight shift at a mountain lodge outside Telluride, Colorado. If you've ever driven through the San Juans in winter, you know how empty it can feel out there after dark. We had a decent lodge, about 40 rooms, mostly booked by skiers-hunters, and the occasional lost traveler who missed the turnoff for Route 550. Winters were quiet aside from the storms, and that February was particularly rough. We'd gotten nearly 4 feet of snow over 6 days. Only one road in or out, and it was barely plowed. Len Turner, our maintenance guy, was the only other staff working overnights. We shared coffee and updates through a walkie, but mostly stayed in our zones. Me at the front desk. Len with the boiler and generator and all the systems that kept the place running. We didn't get many walk-ins during blizzards. So when the door chimed that night just after 2:45 a.m., I wasn't expecting company. He didn't speak, didn't shake off the snow or ask for a room. He just stood there, soaked head to toe, with what looked like a canvas duffel slung over his shoulder. His hood was up, casting his face in shadow, and the only thing I could really make out was that his boots were completely clean. Not wet, not snowy, no salt rings or scuff marks, just clean, like he hadn't been outside at all. I asked if he had a reservation. He slid a room key across the counter, one of ours. It was for room 203. The keycard itself was faded and worn, but the number was still printed on the back. Except we hadn't had anyone checked into 203 for 2 weeks. I knew because I'd cleaned that room myself after the last guests left early due to altitude sickness. I checked the system. The room was empty. No reservations, no flags, no maintenance holds. I looked back up, confused, but the man was already walking toward the staircase. Still hadn't said a word. I called Len. Just a quiet ping on the walkie, didn't want to make a scene. He said he hadn't seen anyone come in through the back, and the snow was too deep for someone to walk in from the main road without leaving tracks. I told him about the man. Len said he'd check the exterior cameras after finishing with the generator reset. That was the end of it for then. I figured maybe the guy had been staying here longer than expected. Maybe his reservation hadn't updated. Maybe it was a glitch. Around 3:15, I heard movement above me. The lodge was mostly empty that night. Maybe 4 rooms were occupied, all on the 3rd floor. But 203 was directly overhead, soft creaking, a thump, then silence. I figured maybe he dropped something heavy, but then I saw the feed from the 2nd floor hallway. Room 203's door was wide open, just standing open with the hallway light shining in. Nobody in view. After a few minutes, I walked upstairs. I've never liked that hallway at night. the way the lights buzzed, the way the exit signs always looked dimmer up there. 203 was open just like the camera showed. The room was dark, bed untouched. The air inside felt off, not cold, not warm, just wrong, like someone had just stepped out but you couldn't tell which direction they went. I didn't go inside. I just called out softly, asked if everything was okay. No response. Then from farther down the hall, maybe 204 or 205, I heard a door click shut, just once, not hard, not hurried, just a quiet, slow click. I went back downstairs, marked it in the shift log. Didn't tell Len, didn't want him thinking I was spooked. At 4:02, the printer behind the desk turned on by itself. No print job, no guest requests, just started feeding blank paper one sheet at a time. I unplugged it, it stopped. By then the snow was falling harder. The windows were completely fogged over, and the only light came from the fireplace and the soft desk lamp. The lobby was silent except for the faint hum of the soda machine and the pop of the wood in the fire. That's when I noticed the footprints, just one set, wet but not snowy. They started at the front door, crossed the lobby, paused near the vending machine, then turned and disappeared halfway across the rug. No return path, no continuation, just gone. I went back to check the door. It was still locked from the inside. No alerts on the system, no new entries on the security log. Around 5:30, Len came by the desk. He looked pale. Said something was off with the power grid, like the backup relay kept resetting even though there was no outage. He asked if I'd seen anyone. I just said, maybe someone wandered in late. Len nodded slowly and didn't ask more. We checked the logs again together. Room 203 hadn't been unlocked electronically since the last guests checked out. No activity. But that card, the one the man handed me, still sat on the counter slightly damp, the room number smudged at the corner. By 7, Huzzero's daylight was starting to come in through the lobby windows, all pale and blue from the snow cover. I walked up to 203 one last time. The door was now closed, not latched, just gently resting in the frame. I pushed it open. The bed was still untouched. The bathroom was empty. But on the windowsill, someone had written something into the condensation. 3 numbers, 2-6, and I wiped the window clear and closed the door without going inside. Len and I never talked about it again. But every year after that, whenever it snowed past a certain depth and the lodge got real quiet, the keycard printer would jam. Always at 2:47 a.m. Always the same grinding sound like it didn't want to let go of something. I don't usually talk about this, not because I'm afraid of being believed, but because I'm not sure I believe it myself. It's been years now, but I still remember the sound that woke me up every time it happened. A low engine rumble idling just outside Pump 4, always around 2 a.m., always on a Wednesday, and always during a storm. Back then, I was 22 and working nights at a fuel station off the Richardson Highway in Alaska, just past Delta Junction. It was more of a supply stop than a full gas station. A narrow building with 2 old diesel pumps, a rusted-out snack shelf, and a little coffee pot that hadn't been cleaned properly since Reagan. I was there to make a few bucks between classes at UAF. I took the shift nobody else wanted, midnight to 6 a.m., mostly because it was quiet. Sometimes entire nights would go by with no customers, just snow tapping the windows and static from the weather radio. There wasn't much to the job. Keep the coffee warm log. Any pump errors, and keep an eye on the occasional trucker passing through with a look that said they hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 days. The place had a few security cameras, grainy old models that only recorded 24-hour loops, and for whatever reason they were all pointed at the pumps, not the building. The first time I saw the truck, I didn't think much of it. It was the last Wednesday in October, and a windstorm had just kicked up off the Tanana Flats. Snow came in sideways that night, turning the floodlights into blurry halos. Around 1:57 a.m., I heard an engine out front. I walked over to the narrow window near the door and saw an old Chevy pickup parked under Pump 4. Light blue with one headlight fogged over and a cracked windshield. The driver didn't get out. At first, I figured he just needed a place to wait out the storm. But after 10 minutes, I started getting that crawling feeling in the back of my neck. You know, the one like someone's watching you even though you can't see their eyes. The truck stayed running lights on, no movement inside. I couldn't make out the driver through the glare. After a while, the engine cut off. Then the lights. Then nothing. I opened the door and stepped out. The wind slapped me hard. It was maybe 5 degrees with the chill, but I forced myself to walk to the window of the truck. Empty. No one in the driver's seat, no footprints in the snow, not leading in, not leading out. I backed away, heart thumping in my ears. I went inside, locked the door, and watched through the glass. An hour later, the truck was gone. The next morning, Edna Voss, the older woman who worked the day shift, noticed. I looked pale. She poured me a cup of the thick, burnt coffee and asked if I'd seen the ghost truck. She didn't laugh when she said it. Didn't smile either. She told me there'd been stories about that truck since the early 90s. Said a man named Walter Hicks used to own a blue Chevy just like it. He went missing in a storm one November night. Car was never found. Only thing left was his parka folded neatly on the bench inside the fuel stop. Edna had worked here back then. She was the one who found it. I chalked it up to small-town myth-making. Didn't think much of it. Until the next Wednesday. Same truck, same storm, same time, give or take a few minutes. This time it pulled in, idled for longer. When I looked out the window, I could see the silhouette of someone sitting perfectly still behind the wheel. Hands on the steering wheel, head tilted slightly toward the building. I didn't go out this time. I stayed inside and watched. I kept checking the cameras, but they never showed the truck arriving. No headlights approaching. No wheels rolling in. Just a sudden cut between one frame and the next, like the truck had always been there. I told Edna the next morning. She said she believed me. Said it always came in bad weather. Said Walter's logbook was still in the back office if I wanted to see it. The pages were filled with tiny, slanted handwriting, fuel tallies, delivery notes, scribbles about maintenance. But near the end, I found a strange pattern. A circled time to 20 a.m., written over and over again, sometimes in red pen, sometimes followed by short notes like, "Came back, no face, still won't leave." The last entry just read, "Don't open the door." After that, I started paying more attention to the weather. Each time a Wednesday rolled around with snow in the forecast, I braced myself. And almost every time the truck came back. It never approached the building, never honked or moved, just parked under Pump 4 with the engine running. And always around 200 a.m., never earlier, never later. One night in December, I tried to take a photo. Used my phone stood at the window aimed through the glass. When I looked at the screen, the image was black, not blurry, not snowy, just pitch black. I stepped away, waited. The truck eventually left. No tire marks, no tracks, just a patch of melted snow where it had sat. I started documenting it, each week, time of arrival, weather conditions, how long it stayed. The pattern held. One night I decided to break it. I parked my car under pump 4 an hour before the usual time, just to see what would happen. At 2:00 a.m., the station lights flickered. I heard the engine sound again, but there was no second truck, just a shadow against my car window, faint like a reflection. But it wasn't me. It leaned close. Then it was gone. By January, I'd stopped opening the blinds, let the snow pile up, stayed in the office with the door locked and my headphones on. But I still felt it. Every stormy Wednesday right on time. That soft vibration in the floor, the hum of the engine outside. One night I made the mistake of turning on the radio. Old AM band. Nothing usually came through but static. But that night I heard something. A faint voice buried in the fuzz, repeating something over and over. Pump 4, don't go out. Pump 4, don't go out. I stopped working there a week later. Told Edna I couldn't do the night shift anymore. She didn't ask why. Just nodded like she understood. A few months after I left, the station burned down. Electrical fire, they said. No one was hurt. But the strange thing was when the investigators pulled the footage from the backup DVR, there was one clip they couldn't explain. It showed the exterior just before the flames started. Pump 4, snow falling, and the blue Chevy sitting under the light engine, running driver still. Only problem, that camera had stopped working in 1993. Back in 2016, I took a trip I'd been putting off for years. My dad and I had always talked about doing one last hunt together, just the two of us, like when I was a kid. He'd been a hunting guide back in the 80s and 90s, before his knees went bad, and he wanted to pass down what he called the Mason tracking method before he got too stiff to walk 10 miles through brush. I was 28 at the time, working HVAC in Anchorage, and I kept putting him off until the fall came, and he finally said, "Son, this year or never." So I cleared a week, packed the gear, and we drove out to the Copper River Basin. It's wild land out there, flat and swampy in parts, but the ridges roll in thick as you get closer to Wrangell St. Elias. We had a small canvas tent, a pair of moose tags, and enough jerky and instant coffee to hold us over. And for the first 2 days, it was perfect. Chilly mornings, crisp air, frost clinging to the brush before the sun hit it. We didn't see much, but Dad swore he heard a bull further up the slope on the second night. Then the kills started showing up. The first was a squirrel barely the size of my boot, but it had been opened clean, almost surgical. No blood, no mess, just the rib cage exposed like someone had taken tweezers and peeled it back. Dad thought it was a hawk or a marten, maybe something playing with its food. But when we found the next one, a fox this time, it had the same clean cut, same absence of blood. After the third one, a young caribou calf with its hindquarters removed, and nothing else touched, Dad stopped pretending it was normal. He got real quiet. Didn't say it out loud, but I could tell he'd seen something like it before and didn't want to admit what he remembered. That night, the wind shifted. We were camped at the base of a ridge just under the tree line, and I stepped out to pee around midnight. The clouds had broken up, and there was just enough moonlight to silhouette the high ridge above our tent. That's when I saw it. Not clearly just a figure tall and narrow standing still at the crest. No flashlight, no headlamp, just there. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds, thinking it might be a hunter, maybe someone scouting, but it didn't move. Didn't shift weight, didn't turn, didn't even seem to breathe. Just stood there staring down toward our camp. I didn't say anything to Dad. Didn't want to spook him. The next morning I noticed boot prints in the mud just north of our tent. But they weren't ours. Different tread, longer stride. And the heel was worn down in a way I'd never seen before. Not like someone walked a lot, but like the ground pressed up into the boot, if that makes sense. Like the impact was wrong. I started feeling watched after that. Every time I crouched in the brush or hiked out to check our snares, I'd get that tingling on the back of my neck. I'd stop and listen, thinking maybe a bear was stalking us, but the woods would go dead silent. No birds, no rustle, no wind, just pressure. On the fourth morning, we found our gear scattered. Nothing stolen, nothing ripped, just moved. My dad's boots were 10 feet from where he'd left them. Our cookpot was hanging from a branch 4 feet above my head. That was when he told me. Said there was a story the old-timers used to tell about that basin. Said there was a thing, not a person, not exactly an animal, that watched hunters who didn't belong. Something that didn't kill outright. Just followed, rearranged, observed. He called it the ridge thing. Said he only half believed it when he was younger, but every time he guided a group through this part of the valley, at least one guy would tap out early. Said they always felt like they were being tracked, like something smart was just behind the trees watching. I laughed it off. Tried to, anyway. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The wind kept knocking the side of the tent in soft thumps, like fingers tapping through the canvas. And around 2:00 a.m., I heard what I can only describe as breathing. It wasn't close. It was coming from up on the ridge again, but it was loud, deep and steady, almost mechanical. Inhale, pause, exhale. Over and over. Too slow for a bear, too steady for a person. I shook my dad awake. He listened for a while, then nodded like he'd been expecting it. Said we'd leave at first light. We packed up at dawn, didn't even bother boiling coffee. The ridge was empty, sky-clear frost turning everything silver. But as we hiked back toward the truck, nearly 5 miles of soft trail and marshy glades, we kept noticing things. Twigs arranged in triangles, a pile of stones we hadn't passed on the way in, a clawed tree trunk, not deep scratches, just surface marks, long, even, symmetrical. My dad didn't talk the whole walk, and I didn't ask questions, because I was starting to understand what silence meant in those woods. Just before we reached the road, I turned around one last time. Couldn't help it. And up on that ridge, faint, small, framed by the early morning sun, was a figure, standing in the exact same place I'd seen it before. Still, watching. Back in 2014, I was part of a research team studying caribou migration patterns along the upper Yukon. We were tracking a herd that moved back and forth across the Alaska-Canada border, and we'd fitted 43 of them with GPS collars the previous spring. It was one of those projects that sounds romantic on paper, field tense, crisp air biologists in flannel, but in reality, it mostly involved squinting at laptop screens while praying the signal didn't drop out again. We were camped about 12 miles west of the border, just past a frost-line bluff that caught satellite reception on good days. By week 3, the frost never left the ground even at midday. The air had that quiet sharpness you only get in the north, like it held its breath between gusts, and every sound seemed farther away than it should have been. Our team was 5 people total, but only 3 of us were out there at base camp that week, me Tom Harris and Dr. Mallory Chen, who was running the study. We had a decent drone set up for thermal flyovers, and every evening we'd go through the footage to see where the herd was shifting. Then the signals started blinking out. First, one caller dropped offline, no movement, just a frozen ping. Then 2 more. By the end of that week, 11 were gone. Just not reporting. No movement, no battery alerts, nothing. We assumed weather at first, maybe interference. But Dr. Chen sent the drone out farther than usual that night, and what we found changed everything. At around 2:30 a.m., we were reviewing the thermal scan when we saw them 7 upright heat signatures, almost human in shape, spaced evenly along a ridge south of the herd's last known location. They weren't moving like people. They moved in perfect unison, 5 steps, then stop, hold for exactly 7 seconds, then 5 steps again. Their shapes didn't shift or wobble like people do. They were rigid cold around the edges, but the cores burned bright like something alive. Tom said it was probably a glitch, but his voice cracked on the word. He was the kind of guy who carried a sidearm into the outhouse, but something about that footage rattled him. He volunteered to hike out the next morning and try to locate one of the collars manually. We gave him the most recent coordinates and watched him disappear into the gray. He had a radio, an extra battery pack, a flare. Standard stuff. He never radioed back. By sunset, we still hadn't heard anything. Dr. Chen wanted to call in a ranger unit, but we were too remote for cell or sat signal, and the ham was spotty. So we waited. And that night at exactly 2:47 a.m., the drone, which had been set on autopilot return, began broadcasting again. Live thermal feed. There were now 6 upright heat signatures on the ridge. No Tom, no new motion, just 6 shapes where there had been 7, still walking, still stopping in perfect rhythm. We stayed up until dawn. Didn't say much, just kept the footage running, watching those shapes cross the ridge and vanish into cloud cover. The next morning, I went out with Dr. Chen to try to find Tom. We marked the drone's last location and started on foot. Snow had begun falling in slow, dry flurries, the kind that sticks to your eyelashes and makes everything around you look smudged and too quiet. After 2 hours, we found his boot prints. They led up toward a split in the slope where a glacial runoff stream had frozen solid. That's where we found them. Not Tom, just his boots, both standing upright on the ice, perfectly aligned toes forward. No drag marks, no scuffing, no sign of a fall. They weren't frozen in place either, just placed there, like someone had stepped out of them and vanished upward. There were no other prints around, no animal sign, no collapse or struggle. We marked the location and left immediately. Neither of us spoke on the hike back. Later that evening, I retrieved one of the collars that had pinged offline the week before. It was half buried in snow about half a mile from base camp. No signs of predator activity, no tracks, no carcass, just the collar. The locking clasp hadn't failed. It had been unclasped manually, cleanly, without breakage. Back at camp, I washed it off and logged it. The data inside showed an abrupt stop in movement, followed by nothing, just blank space, like it had been turned off mid-step. That night I heard crunching outside the tent. It was soft at first, not like a bear, not heavy, more like someone walking slowly over brittle grass, circling. I didn't look. I just lay there holding my breath, listening to the footsteps stop and start, always in intervals, always 5 steps at a time. At 2:47 a.m., everything went still, dead silent. The temperature dropped so fast the condensation on the tent wall turned to frost, and just before it did, I heard something scrape gently along the canvas, 5 lines spaced like fingers, dragging downward once. We left the basin the next morning, packed everything in less than an hour. The other researchers took over remotely after that. They never found Tom. The collars we'd recovered were turned in and logged, the footage too. But when I went back to review the drone files a month later just for closure, that particular thermal segment was missing. The timestamp was there, but the footage itself was blacked out. Even the backup drive, which I'd locked in my own desk drawer, showed the same corruption. Only that one file. Only that one time. Sometimes on cold nights I still think about that ridge, about those 7 shapes, about the boots, and how one day there were only 6. I worked 2 winters at the Glacier Rim Lodge outside Fairbanks. It was the kind of place that only filled up during Aurora season, mostly tourists with cameras and big coats they didn't know how to zip properly. During the off weeks, we ran on a skeleton crew, just me on overnight check-in, a part-time cook named Raina, and sometimes a maintenance guy if the pipes acted up. That year, 2016, we had our first real cold snap by early November. It hit below 0 for 4 nights straight, and with the early snow came a few stranded travelers who booked last minute. That's how we got Troy Sandler. He checked in just after midnight alone. No reservation, no luggage. Said his car broke down near mile 7 and a trucker dropped him off. I remember because his coat looked soaked straight through, but his hair was bone dry. He didn't shiver either, even though I offered him cocoa from the lounge pot, and that thing had been barely warm for hours. He was polite, but something about him made the back of my neck itch. It wasn't how he talked, his voice was quiet, steady, but the way he kept glancing at the hallway behind me, like he expected something else to walk in. I put him in room 3B, which we'd just cleaned that afternoon. I remembered it because it was the only one we'd set with 3 twin beds instead of the usual queen, and I'd muttered to myself about wasting good linens on a solo guest. But when I handed him the key and said something about how you've got plenty of room to stretch out, he just smiled, tight-lipped, and said, "That's good. They'll be tired." I paused maybe a second too long. "Sorry, I thought it was just you tonight." He blinked slowly and said, "Right, just me." I logged it as a weird comment and figured maybe he was just sleep-deprived. The next morning, I didn't see him at breakfast, but the other staff said room 3B was quiet. Nothing unusual. I had the evening off, so I didn't think about it again until the next night when I came in around 9. I did my rounds, checked the logs, and noticed 2 more names had been added under that same reservation, David Cross and Amanda Greer. But I hadn't seen them come through the lobby, and nobody else had either. Their signatures were neat side by side, dated that morning. Same last 4 digits on the license plates as Troy's entry. It was strange, not illegal, just odd, so I walked down to 3B to knock and make sure everything was okay. Troy answered, but he didn't open the door all the way. He just leaned against the frame, keeping his arm across the gap like he was holding it closed behind him. His eyes looked heavy, not tired, but swollen somehow, like he'd been crying or hadn't blinked in a while. I asked if his friends were in, and he said Amanda had gone into town for supplies, and David was probably still asleep. Still asleep, I glanced at my watch. It's past 9. He didn't respond, just gave a small shrug, like it wasn't his place to answer. That night, I checked the guest list again. Sure enough, Amanda and David were still listed, but the database wouldn't show their IDs, just a placeholder error. That wasn't normal. I flagged it for the manager, Kevin, who said it was probably a software hiccup and told me to reboot the terminal. I did. It didn't help. The following morning, Raina found a broken coffee mug outside room 3B. It wasn't ours, not lodge issue. It had a faded orange design on it that none of us recognized. The handle was snapped clean off and the rim looked scorched like it had been exposed to fire. But the air was below freezing and the snow around it was perfectly undisturbed. No footprints, no tracks, no melted patch beneath. That was the day Troy disappeared. It was about 4:15 p.m. when Raina went up to drop fresh towels. She knocked, no answer. The room was unlocked, lights on. All 3 beds were made, but one had a deep dent in the mattress like someone had sat there for hours. The shower was dripping, and a single sock, just one dark green, lay in the middle of the carpet. No bags, no jackets, no sign of Troy, Amanda, or David. We called the local sheriff's office. Deputy Lorne came out around 6, looked over the room, asked the usual questions. He didn't seem alarmed until I showed him the guest book and mentioned the missing ID scans. He pulled out a printed sheet from his car and matched the names. David Cross and Amanda Greer both reported missing 2 years ago from separate towns in Idaho, never linked, no known connection. Troy Sandler, as far as anyone knew, had no criminal record, no prior sightings, and no digital footprint at all before that week. We pulled the security footage which only covered the lobby and parking lot. Troy appears entering the lodge alone at 12:03 a.m., just like I remembered. The door opens, he walks in, coat dripping, but from that moment on, something's off. The footage glitches for exactly 3 seconds as he crosses the rug. When it returns, he's standing still at the desk, staring forward. No one's behind the counter. I should have been there, I was on shift, but my figure never appears on screen. It's like he was talking to no one. Then the door opens again by itself and swings gently inward, stopping halfway. No wind, no person, just that slow, creeping motion. Troy turns his head toward it, nods once, and then looks back at the desk. The footage ends there. Corrupt file. No backup. We kept the room closed for 3 weeks after that. When we finally reopened it, the carpets had dried oddly stiff patches near the corners and a faint smell like copper and burnt rubber. I don't think Kevin believed half of what we reported, but he let us move guests to other rooms if they requested it. Sometimes on the quieter nights, I'd walk past 3B and swear I could hear whispering too low to make out, but constant like 3 voices talking just behind the door. Always 3, and always after midnight. I once worked at a private lodge tucked up near the Vermont border, a quiet place surrounded by sugar maples, and always about 5 degrees colder than the forecast claimed. It wasn't one of those chain hotels with plastic furniture and electric fireplaces. This one was old wood oil lamps, thick rugs that muffled your steps. We called it the White Pine Mountain Retreat. Though there hadn't been a white pine on the grounds in years, I'd taken the job the spring after my dad passed. I was 31 then and trying to keep my head down away from the city and the noise. Most guests were couples escaping for the weekend, or older folks who liked that we had no TVs in the rooms. The lodge only had 12 units, 1 cook, 2 housekeepers, and me on the front desk. At night it got real quiet, so quiet you could hear the furnace kick on from the far end of the east wing. That winter we had a run of single guests, quiet types. I remember one in particular, a man named Daniel Ree, who booked a corner unit on the 2nd floor for 2 weeks in January. He didn't talk much, but he wasn't rude. Just thoughtful, maybe a little tired-looking. He asked me once if we had any yoga mats. Another time he mentioned the fireplace in his room made strange knocking sounds at night, like tapping from inside the wall. I told him it was probably the old pipes, since that building had been built in sections and the heating system wasn't exactly symmetrical. He nodded and didn't bring it up again. A few days later, Eric, our maintenance guy, mentioned that the utility closet outside Daniel's room wouldn't stay locked. He said he'd fastened it shut twice and both times found it hanging open again by the morning. It wasn't a big deal, just a supply room with backup batteries, flashlights, and an old mop bucket no one used anymore. But Eric asked if we'd had guests snooping around, and I said no. The hallway on that side didn't get much traffic. I offered to check it myself the next time I passed through. The door was closed when I walked by. Nothing strange about it at first, just a plain oak door with a tarnished brass knob. I pulled on it gently and, sure enough, unlocked. The latch wasn't even catching. I stepped inside with my phone flashlight and saw the shelves in order: extra soap bars, spare light bulbs, emergency blankets in vacuum-sealed bags. But there was a smell faint like old vinegar or rainwater that had seeped into cardboard. I backed out, closed it again, and this time pulled hard until I heard the latch click. Eric said he'd keep an eye on it. That would have been the end of it, just another quirk in an old building, except Daniel came to the front desk the next morning, looking pale and nervous. He said he was sorry to bother me, but asked if anyone had entered his room during the night. I told him no. Only staff had keys, and Shirley didn't start her rounds until 9 a.m. He nodded, looked down at his hands, and said he thought he'd heard someone pacing in the hallway. Around 2:30 a.m., he'd opened his door to check, and that closet was wide open again. He swore he saw the mop bucket in the middle of the hallway. When he looked again, a minute later, it was gone. I offered to move him to another room, but he said no, just wanted to know if he was imagining things. I told him I'd ask Eric to double-check the locks. The next evening, after the sun had gone down and the wood stove was humming behind the lobby desk, I got a call from room 9. It was Daniel again. He didn't sound scared, just hesitant. "There's someone in the closet," he said. I paused. "You mean the utility closet?" "No," he replied. "The other one." His room had a built-in wardrobe near the fireplace, antique heavy wood with carved trim. We kept it empty. I said I'd come up and check. By the time I got there, Daniel had stepped into the hallway. He looked embarrassed. I asked if he was sure he'd heard something, and he nodded. It wasn't banging this time, he said. It was whispering, just one voice. I opened the wardrobe myself. Empty. No dust, no marks. The smell of vinegar was stronger, though faint but unmistakable, like damp rot under fresh polish. Daniel left early the next morning. Said something about family obligations. When Shirley went in to clean the room, she found the wardrobe open. There were fingerprints along the inner edge of the door, not just one set but several, as if someone had opened it from the inside. Eric checked the closet outside in the hallway again. The latch had been broken off completely, not unscrewed, snapped clean. The next guest to stay in room 9 didn't mention anything. Neither did the one after that. But the third, a young woman traveling alone. She left in the middle of the night. Didn't stop to explain, didn't ask for a refund. Just tossed the key on the desk and walked out into the snow. Eric finally bolted the hallway closet shut from the inside and screwed a plywood panel over the door. Said he didn't want anyone going in there again, not staff, not guests, not himself. Shirley told me the vinegar smell was still there weeks later, even after we aired the place out with fans. We don't assign room 9 anymore, unless every other one is full. I still get emails from people who've stayed at White Pine. They compliment the quiet, the warmth, the view of the snow-dusted evergreens through the tall windows. But sometimes buried in those emails, there's a line that stands out. One man wrote, "You might want to check the door outside room 9. I think it opened on its own last night." Another said, "Beautiful stay. Just curious what's behind that locked closet in the east wing." I never answer those directly. There's nothing back there. At least, nothing I want to check on again. I'd flown into St. Louis late on a Thursday night in December. There'd been delays out of Denver, and by the time I landed, the ground shuttle to my original hotel had stopped running. The airport concierge recommended a place nearby, a newer airport hotel with a quiet reputation. Clean enough, he said, and they usually had rooms. It was cold that night, the kind of Midwest chill that sinks into your jeans when you wait too long at the curb. The hotel shuttle pulled up half empty, and the ride took maybe 5 minutes. The place looked typical from the outside, beige, stucco, blue signage, one light flickering over the covered entryway. The woman at the desk, Kimber, checked me in with a kind of mechanical politeness I was used to by then. She handed me a room key for 512. I remember that number because it struck me as odd when I got into the elevator. The panel only went up to 5, but there was no room 512 listed on the floor plan posted inside the elevator. Rooms went from 501 to 511. No 512. I assumed it was a typo or maybe a storage closet converted to a guest room. These places do that sometimes when occupancy gets tight. I stepped out onto the 5th floor, a hallway lit with soft amber bulbs, the kind that make every surface look vaguely gold and old. Room 512 was at the very end, tucked just around the corner from the elevator, not quite in sight until you walked all the way down. The door was flush with the wall, no peephole, just a dark bronze handle and the usual keycard lock. Inside, the room was fine, smaller than most. The thermostat didn't work, but it wasn't freezing. There was a desk with a lamp that didn't turn on, and a bed that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and something older underneath, like carpet glue that had never fully dried. I was too tired to care. I remember waking up sometime after 2 a.m. because I heard knocking. It wasn't loud, just a steady, slow tap 3 knocks, then nothing. I thought it came from the room next to mine, but when I sat up I realized something. There was no room next to mine. Room 512 was at the end of the hall. I got out of bed and checked the hallway. No one was there. The air felt heavy, like the hallway hadn't been ventilated in a while. When I returned to the room, I noticed the thermostat was now blinking LO in red digits, even though I hadn't touched it. In the morning, I stopped by the front desk to ask about the floor layout. Kimber smiled, typed something, and said, "You were in 502, right?" I corrected her. "No, 512. Her smile froze just slightly. Then she blinked, looked back at the screen, and said, "Right? Yes, 512. She handed me my receipt without another word. Back in the elevator, I checked the diagram again. 512 wasn't there. Later that day, I called from the airport to ask if I'd left my charger in the room. A man answered Rodney, the night security guard, and when I gave him the room number, he paused. "We don't have a 512, sir." I told him I stayed there the night before, even gave him the receipt number. He asked me to hold, then came back on and said, "I don't know who checked you in, but I'll take a look." About 10 minutes later, he called me back. He said he'd gone up to the 5th floor, and there was a locked maintenance door where 512 should have been. No keypad lock, just a brass knob, and a sign that said, "Authorized staff only." He said there were no signs anyone had stayed in that room in months. I asked if he saw any room keys for 512 in their box. He said there wasn't one. That night I couldn't stop thinking about the knocks, the blinking thermostat, that room with no peephole. When I tried to pull up the hotel on Google Maps, the listing showed a different photo than the place I'd stayed, similar name, but wrong signage. The pin was placed on the opposite side of the highway. I've looked it up a few times since. I can't find the version I stayed at, not the building, not the interior, not the lobby. Just 2 hotels with near-identical names, neither of which has a room 512. I still have the receipt. It's faded now, but you can make out the room number. And sometimes when I check into quiet hotels late at night, I walk the halls just to see if there's a door that shouldn't be there, one without a number just out of sight from the elevator where the floor plan ends, but the hallway doesn't. That was the last story I'll share tonight. But the truth is, most of these places weren't supposed to be memorable. A snowy road, a motel with thin walls, a hallway no one walked at night. We pass through them because they're ordinary, because they're supposed to vanish from memory once we leave. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they echo long after we're gone, in the shape of a door, the tick of a thermostat, or the silence where someone should have been. What makes these stories stay isn't what we saw. It's what didn't make sense. A look, a sound, a missing footprint. They add up slowly until you can't quite explain why you still remember that night or that place or that stranger you never really saw, but you do. You remember it clearly even now. That's what quiet horror does. It waits until the moment you think you've forgotten, and then it comes back like it never left. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If these stories kept you company tonight, please consider following the channel, sharing it with someone who enjoys a quiet chill, and subscribing for future nights. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever stayed somewhere that didn't exist on the map but still lingers in your memory? Sleep well and be careful what doors you open in the dark.